Hello and welcome to another body language video. Today we're going to be looking at Sergey Lavrov and we're going to be looking at four things in particular. First of all, we'll look at his voice intonation and what that means for Lavrov and what kind of intentions he puts across with his voice intonation. And then secondly, we'll look at lip tension and what kind of circumstances Lavrov tenses his lips and relaxes his lips. Then thirdly, we'll look at some still shots of Lavrov, some photos, and look at his body language in more detail and more specifically his facial expressions. And then last of all, we'll do a short discourse analysis. Regarding Lavrov's voice intonation, I'd like to specifically look at what he does at the end of his sentences, whether he ends them on an up note or a down note. And if we look specifically, first of all, at when he ends his sentences upwards, along with the words he uses, when he finishes his sentences on an upward note, he's usually much more open, more willing to cooperate and answer the interviewer's questions. Listen for how his voice is generally higher, and at the end of his sentences he usually goes up in notes. His voice goes up like this, and he usually uses this when he's talking about cooperation or openness.
It addressed important issues, and we hope that.
So again, it's very like this, and it's very at the top of his voice, and it's, he's saying, whatever, you can ask whichever questions you want, kind of thing. In this same interview, when he's talking about, it's quite an open topic.
Are you going to present the evidence? Yes, I just presented a compilation of evidence to John Kerry when we met a couple of hours ago.
So then the interviewer asks him, are you willing to present this evidence? He's talking about, I think, chemical weapons in Syria. And he says, yes, we are. I just presented the evidence to John Kerry when we met a couple of minutes ago, or something like that. So generally his voice is up, and at the end of the sentence his tone goes up as well. Here again.
US-Russian relations, yes, I believe we agree that these relations should be promoted. When President Obama came to the White House, he and his team reassessed the situation in the relationship between Moscow and Washington.
So again, he talks about US-Russian relations and saying how it should be promoted, so his voice goes up again, and then how him and Obama spoke, or Putin and Obama spoke about this, and it should be promoted, and it should be great, and it'll be great, and things like that. And his voice is again up, and it talks about openness or a good relationship. And again in this video, in this clip.
But having said this, I do believe that there are always problems between any two countries.
So he's being open, he's saying. And now I want to have a look at what Lavrov, what his intentions are when his sentences end on a lower note. Usually when his sentences finish on a lower note and his voice goes down, he's more serious, obviously, and also there's a tendency where he wants to make a point that challenges what the interviewer has said. Okay, now listen for how his sentences in these clips finish on a down note, on a lower note. And it's usually, he uses this when he wants to make something crystal clear to his interviewer. He's much more serious when his voice goes downwards.
Was supplying arms to the rebels in violation of the Security Council resolutions. I want to make one thing very clear.
I want to make something very clear. His voice goes really noticeably down in his notes.
We were not wedded to Mr. Gaddafi.
We are not wedded to Mr. Gaddafi. His voice goes down again.
We are not wedded to Mr. Assad.
We are not wedded to Mr. Assad. It goes down again.
He was educated not in the Russian Federation. He was educated in Europe.
So again, da 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 da. So it goes down again. He does it in this clip again.
No indications that Iran has taken a political decision to go military in it.
La 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 la. So he goes down again to go military. So he wants to make that very clear.
It's nuclear.
But a political decision to have the capacity is different, is it not?
No.
You can't
As
make
I
that distinction.
As I said, they do not hide. They make it public, and IAEA knows this, that they want to have full nuclear fuel cycle, which is allowed and which is absolutely legal under the non-proliferation treaty.
You believe they want
Non-proliferation treaty. So it goes down again. He wants to make that very clear and case closed kind of scenario. He does it again in this clip. It's less clear here, but bear with me.
Our experts underestimated the situation, and you had a better assessment of the situation here in Russia?
It's not about assessment of situation, if you mean how long the president of Syria would hold on power.
Da 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 da. So it goes down again. Here he's talking about the interviewer's just told him that different countries have different assessments of the situation on the ground in Syria, and he's saying it's not really about. Now I'm going to have a look at lip tension and Lavrov's lip tension. As you can see here, he uses it quite frequently in correlation with the levels of stress in an interview and also with the level of disagreement or confrontation. So watch his lips and see how they tense up in this video when he finishes his sentence.
In sync, telling the parties that we don't want any military solution, that we don't want any further loss of the Syrian lives, and that we want them to start negotiating in earnest. Unless we do this, this crisis would continue and more blood would be spilled.
So he's saying unless we have constructive negotiations, more blood will be spilled. It's a grave situation, causes a lot of tension. His lips are tensed. They're pursed in a way. They've almost disappeared. He also does it here.
government on Syria. What is the circumstance on the ground today as you understand it?
Well, it's a civil war.
So when he said civil war, his lips tensed again.
Government on Syria. What is the circumstance on the ground today as you understand it?
Well, it's a civil war.
So again, it's a grave situation. It's obviously the beginning of the interview as well, so he's just getting warmed up. Maybe a little bit of tension. His shoulders are up anyway. He's frowning as well. He looks quite tense. But this interview is interesting because as he gets through the interview, from about 34:40, he starts to purse his lip after every single time he finishes his sentences. Generally, there is more tension and more stress as this interview goes along, and as the questions get more grueling and more confronting and more challenging, and there's more tension. And with the tension, as the tension increases, so does the amount of time Lavrov seems to purse his lips or tense his lips. It's here again.
Not in Russia. And when people say that you are protecting President Assad, this is absolute ignorance of the real situation.
Well, I believe you're protecting him, and why am I ignorant?
In what way, Charlie? Can you tell me in what way are we protecting him?
In several ways. Most people believe that if it did not have Russian support, and Iranian support, he would not last very long. But both in terms of
So you can see here his lips are tensed again. Obviously, Charlie Rose has accused the Russian government of something quite big. Obviously, Lavrov's natural response would be to rebut that as soon as he says that, but he's politely waiting until Rose finishes. But he's restraining himself, I suppose, by holding his lips back. He seems to be kind of biting his lips.
arms, and in the Iranian case, some suggest more than that. Without Iranian support and Russian support, most people believe that President Assad would be...
So again, his lips are even more tense here when he's pursing them. So Charlie Rose is accusing the Russian government even more, and his lips are even more pursed, and I think he's really trying to not speak and let Charlie Rose finish.
out of Syria in a shorter time than otherwise he might last.
That's the power of the media.
And he does it here again later on in the interview.
But
So Iran must be engaged. Iran has its own legitimate security
don't
concerns.
you believe that the president...
So again, you just saw at the end he pursed his lips, and that's an example. I'll show it to you again.
Iran has its own legitimate security
Don't
concerns.
you believe that...
Here we go. So it's pursed, and generally throughout this whole interview, especially at the end, almost every time he finishes his sentences, he's pursing his lips, similar to this way, and that's as the tension increases in the interview. Just looking at some still pictures of Lavrov, generally he moves his body a lot less than Kerry, but his face is a lot more expressive, especially his lower face and his lips. So in this picture, Lavrov I have black and white pictures because I feel it's much easier to see the differences in people's faces that way. And I've got a couple of pictures of Lavrov with showing his face with different emotions. This picture, he has crow's feet, so this is a very genuine smile here. There's unequal eye squinting, which lots of people do when they're really, really smiling, because it's not put on, you're just feeling whatever you're feeling when you're smiling, I suppose. The dominant facial muscles used in this picture seem to be around his eyes and also around his mouth. That's where the most tension is, where the most muscle is used. Also, there's a nose wrinkle here. It's very genuine. Also, maybe some happiness or delight. And there's a full lower lip here. We were talking about the lips earlier, and the upper lip is drawn back with the smile here. You look at this picture. This picture is very interesting because there's a half eyelid here. This is a very amused facial expression. These lips are also extremely interesting, the shape they make. His right eyebrow is generally very expressive. It usually lifts a lot more than his left eyebrow, I found in the videos I watched of him. And you have these wrinkles here on the forehead. I wanted to point out that in colour, if you look at this photo in colour, his eyes are almost sparkling. He has this kind of amused look on his face, which is what really made me think about how, even though Kerry uses his hands a lot more, his arms a lot more, Lavrov uses them comparatively less, but his face is comparatively much more expressive. It's much more subtle, I suppose. This photo is also really interesting. Again, his lips are being very expressive here. It's a lot of tension in his lips here. There's more pronounced side lines here near his nose, so a lot of tension on the lips and the nose area. It almost creates a facial expression of disgust with the nose. And this picture here. So this one, the upper lip is completely gone, and there's a lot of tension there, and the neck is hidden. He's kind of tucked his neck inside, and you can see how the neck's kind of, he's brought his head into his kind of shoulders here, and the eyebrows, there's lots of expression in his eyes here. It's quite an uncomfortable picture to look at because he looks quite uncomfortable himself or serious. And there's a slight squint, and there's no eyelids. Well, there's hardly any eyelids in this picture. In the last picture, again, this is a very expressive, his face is extremely expressive. His right eyebrow again is lifted, which the left eyebrow hardly does for Lavrov. And there's no squint in this picture. He's looking directly at somebody, unflinchingly, I suspect. There's no squint. He's really looking at somebody or staring at them. There are no eyelids again, and very thin lips here, again. And he's looking from underneath his eyebrows. I mean, this doesn't have to be this facial expression. Some people would be general and say, "Oh, this is a negative facial expression. He's angry or something," but he could be just thinking. We don't know. And notice how straight, I mean, this line is just here because this is something I was fascinated with, that we all have generally the same facial muscles. We all have cheek muscles, lip muscles, muscles around the eyes, forehead muscles, but everybody's face is just composed differently because of their weight, their age, their genetics, their bone structures, which are brought down to them from generations. And notice how in this picture his cheek is very straight. He's got a very straight face. I thought that was really interesting. It's just one observation. I found it interesting to do a discourse analysis of Lavrov's interview with Charlie Rose. He uses the phrase "I believe" a lot, or the word "believe" he uses a lot. He uses the phrase "I believe" 4 times. He uses the phrase "we believe," "we do believe," "I do believe that." So there's a lot of the word "believe." Generally, he uses a couple of visual phrases, but I think he's more audio. There's a couple of reasons why I can justify that. I mean, there are kinesthetic phrases he uses, sitting down and negotiating and discussing heavier prices, pushing in certain directions in negotiations. But generally, he's audio in his discourse. He uses the phrase recall, interaction, talks about dialogue. But again, people could argue, well, you're a diplomat, you would use the word dialogue a lot. But he says things like mentioned. He uses a statement in his opening presentation in the interview from a Russian foreign minister, and that says a lot about how a person is oriented. He uses a quote, a statement. Also, one of his quicker responses, he says it depends who you listen to. It's not who you watch or who you're aligned with. He literally says it depends who you listen to. He talks about receiving and responding, saying, discuss, recall, speak, call upon. And the reason I do think he's audio is because Charlie Rose seems to have picked up on this as well. And he uses the phrases, when Charlie Rose is interviewing Lavrov, if you watch Charlie Rose's responses, he feeds Lavrov and he realizes that Lavrov uses these audio terms. And he also responds using audio cues. There is much to talk about there, he says to Lavrov. There's much conversation on, so it's all audio-orientated or speaking-orientated. He says, instead of telling me what do you see or what do you feel, Charlie Rose tells Lavrov, tell me exactly what you think. Do you think it's reasonable to ask? He could have asked, do you think it's reasonable to envision, or do you think it's reasonable to say that I feel? Or he also said, it is said that you and your government. So a lot of his questions to Lavrov, I feel, are tailored to Lavrov's audio style. Again, Charlie Rose also picks up on the fact that Lavrov is using the word believe a lot. And he says also to Lavrov, well, I believe. Most people believe that. You believe none of this is true. So I guess Charlie Rose is very good at that. Just a couple of things about Lavrov. Now, these are all things I've got from the internet, so I can't validate what's true and what's not true. But Wikipedia says that he was born 21st of March 1950. Parents' background, it says his father was a civil servant of Armenian origin who lived in Tbilisi, which is in Georgia, and that his mother was in the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Trade. It said that he wanted to do, I think was this Wikipedia or Forbes magazine? One of the two said that he wanted to study physics when he was younger. And it said that he had a teacher that had a major influence on him personally and academically was his physics teacher, and that he wanted to pursue a career in science but was persuaded into diplomacy by his mother. Regarding his kind of value set, I saw a quote by him saying that a real diplomat is an erudite person who has a deep knowledge of history. So I think that's something he values, history and having a knowledge of history. And also sometimes I wonder if he likes to keep his personal life separate, or he doesn't like to talk about it, or he doesn't like to mix his diplomatic and personal life together, which is completely fair. Because from an interview by a lady called Sarah Glassner, I think that's Forbes magazine, Foreign Policy magazine. Because of that interview, I do wonder whether he doesn't like talking about his private life, and fairly, because obviously, it's good to not talk about your private life when you're a diplomat. You're so in the public eye so much. She asked him why he decided to study such an obscure language like Sinhala at the beginning of his diplomatic career, and also why he chose whitewater rafting as a sport of his recreation. And he said she saw a flash of anger across his face, and he stood up abruptly and switched from English to Russian and shouted across the table at the Foreign Ministry's press service, saying, "Why didn't you tell me what time it is?" And then he said, "No, I'm not doing that. I'm not answering these." Pulled his microphone off his jacket and started to leave. briefly shook her hand and stalked out the room without a word. So that makes me wonder, and kind of admire him in a way for keeping his private life so separate. I'd be lucky to do that. How does he see himself? There was an interview, Foreign Policy magazine, where they quoted someone called Kozyrev, who was saying that Lavrov is a Soviet-breed diplomat. So, and that he was saying that Lavrov was brought up in the Soviet system, and that this had a kind of ideological confrontation with the West. Now, I don't know if that's Foreign Policy magazine overemphasizing how different Russian diplomats are from what we call Western diplomats. I'm sure Soviet diplomats understand that they have to adapt, and they have adapted. So I'm not sure how big this ideological difference is. We're not, everybody's adapting now. Plays the guitar. Apparently writes songs and poetry. Apparently he composed the anthem for the Moscow Institute of Foreign Relations. I tried to find an English version, I couldn't find one. Apparently he was famous for drawing and doodling, which I do. But this is in David Bosco's 5 to Rule Them All. That's the name of the book. He says that Lavrov was famous for his drawings, and that Lavrov loved to sketch things in debates at the UN when he was working at the UN, and that he would often draw caricatures of his colleagues with speech bubbles, and that people would linger near his seat at the end to collect the works of art that he left behind. I think that's really interesting. Sports, like I said, white water rafting. I read somewhere that he used to play football as a child, and that he spent some of his early days, I don't know how many, in Norilsk, which is in northern Russia near Siberia. And there's a Spartak stadium close by, and I think one of the teams he supports is Spartak. He seems to be a smoker. I don't know whether he stopped smoking now or what's happening, because people stop and they start, but at some point Lavrov was a smoker, and I read this because there was a ban at the UN enforced by Kofi Annan in 2003, I think about not smoking indoors or something, and he was said to have loudly condemned the ban as a violation of diplomatic rights. Yeah. And another diplomat has said about Lavrov that he's always looking for a chance to go out and have a drag, in terms of smoking. Identifying people of interest, he quoted Alexander Gorbachev. Let me say that right. Gorchakov. He's quoted this guy more than once. Gorchakov was a foreign minister quite an early foreign minister. Back in the day, they called them chancellors, and he was the longest-serving minister in the Russian Empire, apparently. And Lavrov has quoted him a couple of times, so I'm wondering whether that's one of his role models, or he particularly likes the negotiating style of this man, or whether he has some connection to this man, or whether this is just a popular man generally with Russian diplomats, or it could be somebody who he's learnt a lot about, so it could be anything. But he quotes Gorchakov in his interview with Charlie Rose in 2012, September, and he also quotes Gorchakov in his interview with Sarah Glassner with Foreign Policy magazine in 2013. Thank you for watching, wherever you are. I hope you have a great day.